Texas summer of 1943. The desert stretched endless under a merciless sun, heat rippling off sand and scrub brush like molten glass. Somewhere in that vastness, a German prisoner of war named Johann Kramer ran, his feet bleeding, his throat raw with thirst. Behind him, Camp Commander Colonel James Maxwell tracked his path, following boot prints that told a story of desperation. Maxwell had chased escaped prisoners before. He expected to find a man hiding, defiant, clinging to Nazi ideology even in the wilderness. What he found instead would shake everything he understood about the enemy, about humanity, and about the strange war being fought in the heartland of America. Camp Bowie sat in the West Texas desert like a scar on the landscape, a sprawl of barbed wire and wooden barracks where temperatures reached 115 degrees by midday. Dust devils danced between guard towers. The horizon swallowed distance and hope in equal measure. The camp housed over 3,000 German prisoners of war, most captured in North Africa after Rommel's Africa Corps collapsed. They arrived by train, cramped in POW cars, their gray-green uniforms stained with sand and sweat, their eyes hollow with defeat. Johann Kramer arrived in May of 1943. 23 years old, a corporal from Stuttgart, he had been captured at Tunis when his supply convoy was overrun by American armor. The propaganda had promised him that Americans were brutal, that prisoners faced torture and execution. The reality proved stranger. The guards carried rifles but rarely pointed them. The barracks had screens on the windows. The mess hall served portions larger than anything Johann had eaten in 2 years. At night, the prisoners could hear music drifting from the American quarters, jazz, that degenerate Negro music the party had forbidden, and sometimes laughter. "They feed us like kings," Carl Weber whispered in the barracks that first night, his voice uncertain. Why? Johann had no answer. The Geneva Convention required adequate food, but this felt like something beyond obligation. The bacon at breakfast was real. The coffee was hot. The bread was white and soft, not the sawdust-mixed rations they had survived on in Africa. Colonel James Maxwell ran Camp Bowie, with a philosophy that bewildered both his guards and his prisoners. 47 years old, a veteran of the First War, Maxwell believed that cruelty bred resistance while humanity dissolved it. He had seen what bitterness could do, had watched it poison men's souls in the trenches of France. He refused to let his camp become another breeding ground for hate. "These men are soldiers, not monsters," he told his staff during the first week. "Treat them with the dignity their uniforms deserve, and most will respond in kind." The other officers thought him soft. The prisoners thought him cunning, suspected psychological warfare, waited for the trap to spring. But weeks passed, and no trap came. The prisoners worked the farms surrounding the camp, picking cotton under the vast sky, repairing fences, hauling irrigation equipment. The farmers paid the U.S. government, which paid the prisoners in camp scrip, worthless paper money good only at the camp canteen, where they could buy cigarettes, candy, writing paper. Johann worked the field 6 days a week. The labor was hard but honest, nothing like the degradation he had expected. The American guards watched but rarely interfered. The farmer who owned the land, a weathered man named Tom Hutchins, sometimes brought cold lemonade to the work crews, his teenage son helping to distribute tin cups. "Drink up," Hutchins would say, his accent thick as molasses. Plenty more where that came from. Johann drank, the tartness cutting through the dust in his throat, and felt confused by this kindness from a man whose country he had tried to destroy. By midsummer, the heat became unbearable. Men collapsed in the fields. The guards called for water, for shade breaks, for medical attention. This too confused Johann. He had been taught that Americans valued efficiency over humanity, that capitalism made men into machines. Yet here they were, stopping work to care for prisoners who meant nothing to them. At night, Johann wrote letters home to his mother in Stuttgart. The censors read everything, so he kept his words careful, neutral. He described the heat, the endless sky, the strange food. He did not describe the confusion growing in his chest, the slow erosion of everything he had been taught to believe. The other prisoners noticed it too. In the barracks after dark, men whispered about the contradictions, the kindness that didn't align with propaganda, the humanity that shouldn't exist in the enemy. "They're weakening us," Klaus Bauer insisted, a hard-eyed sergeant from Munich who still wore his party pin hidden in his boot. "Making us forget who we are, what we fight for. This is psychological warfare." But Weber shook his head. "Or maybe we were lied to." The words hung in the darkness like smoke. No one responded. The idea was too dangerous, too destabilizing. If they had been lied to about this, what else was a lie? August brought no relief from the heat. The desert shimmered like a fever dream, mirages pooling on the horizon, promising water that didn't exist. Inside the camp, tensions simmered beneath the surface courtesy. Johann noticed it first in the letters that arrived, or didn't arrive. His mother's correspondence had been regular until July, then stopped. Other prisoners reported the same. The censors provided no explanations. The Red Cross packages that usually came monthly were delayed. Then came the newspapers. Maxwell allowed the prisoners to receive German-language papers from New York, heavily censored, but still containing news from home. The July edition spoke of increased bombing raids on German cities: Hamburg, Stuttgart, Cologne. The pages showed photographs of ruins, of ash, of survivors walking through rubble. Johann stared at a photograph of a Stuttgart street he recognized, now reduced to broken walls and twisted steel. His mother lived 3 blocks from there. The letter he had been waiting for would never come. He sat on his bunk that night, the newspaper crumpled in his fists, and felt something break inside him. Not his loyalty to Germany, that remained, but his ability to accept his imprisonment peacefully. His mother might be dead, his city was burning, and he was here, in this strange, comfortable cage, picking cotton for farmers who smiled and offered lemonade while his world ended. Klaus Bauer sensed the shift. He moved through the barracks like smoke, whispering to men whose eyes had gone hollow with grief, whose hands shook with impotent rage. "We are soldiers," he hissed to Johann, "not cattle. We have a duty to resist, to escape, to return to the fight." "There's nowhere to go," Johann replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're in the middle of a desert hundreds of miles from either coast." "Mexico," Bauer said, 300 miles south, the border. From there we can make contact with sympathizers, find passage back to Germany." It was fantasy, desperation masquerading as strategy. Mexico had joined the Allies. There were no sympathizers waiting with open arms. The distance was impossible on foot through desert that killed experienced travelers. But Johann's mother was dead, or dying, or trapped in ruins while he ate bacon and picked cotton under the endless Texas sky. The logic didn't matter anymore, only the need to act, to do something, to be a soldier again instead of a comfortable prisoner. 3 others joined the plan. Werner Schultz, a quiet farm boy from Bavaria, Hans Dietrich, a tank commander from Berlin, and Karl Vogel, a pilot shot down over Tunisia. 5 men, bound together by grief and desperation, and the illusion that they could cross a desert and somehow make a difference. They planned for 2 weeks, saved bread from meals, stole extra canteens from the work details, studied the guard rotations, the fence weaknesses, the blind spots in the searchlight patterns. Maxwell noticed something changing in the camp. He couldn't pinpoint it exactly, just a tension in the air, conversations that stopped when guards approached, eyes that wouldn't quite meet his. "Keep alert," he told his sergeant, "something's brewing." But he didn't increase patrols or tighten restrictions. Maxwell believed in his philosophy, trusted that the humanity he showed would prevent exactly this kind of desperate act. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. September 11th, 1943. The moon hung thin as a blade, offering barely enough light to see by. Johann waited in his bunk until the guard completed his midnight round, counted to 100, then rose silently. The others were ready. They had worn their boots to bed, had their stolen supplies hidden under thin blankets. No one spoke. Communication happened through gestures, through years of military training that made words unnecessary. The fence was weak near the laundry building where the ground dipped and water erosion had loosened the posts. They had noticed it 3 weeks earlier, had been carefully working the wire loose during work details, bending it back just enough to create a gap. Werner went first. He crawled under the fence like a snake, his body pressed flat against the sand. The wire caught his shirt, and for one terrible moment Johann thought it would snag, would tear, would alert the guards. Then Werner was through. Hans followed. Then Karl. Then Klaus Bauer, who turned back and locked eyes with Johann. "For Germany," Bauer whispered. Johann nodded, though he wasn't certain anymore what Germany meant. The rubble of Stuttgart or the kindness of Tom Hutchins, the propaganda he had believed or the reality he had lived. He crawled under the fence. The wire scraped his back. The sand was cool against his palms. And then he was free, standing in the desert darkness, breathing air that felt different outside the wire, even though it was the same air. They ran. The camp fell behind them, lights growing smaller, until it was just a dim glow on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The desert stretched endless in all directions, darker than any darkness Johann had known in Europe. They ran south, using the North Star behind them as their guide, their boots crunching on hardpan and scattered stones. The temperature dropped as night deepened. By 2 in the morning, Johann was shivering despite the exertion, his breath visible in the starlight. At dawn, they found shelter in a dry wash, a depression in the earth where erosion had carved a shallow cave beneath an overhang of rock. They drank water sparingly, ate the bread they had saved, and tried to sleep while the sun climbed and the temperature soared. Johann couldn't sleep. He lay in the shade, watching heat waves ripple across the desert, and thought about his mother. If she was alive, would she want him to die in this wilderness? If she was dead, what was the point of any of this? By late afternoon, Maxwell knew they were gone. The evening head count came up 5 short. The fence breach was discovered. The trail of boot prints led south into the wasteland. Maxwell stood at the fence gap, his hat in his hands, and felt the weight of failure settle on his shoulders. He had believed in humanity, in kindness, in the power of decent treatment to transform enemies into men worthy of trust. 5 Germans had just proven him wrong. "Gather a search party," he told his sergeant. "Horses, water, medical supplies. They have maybe 30 hours before the desert kills them." "Sir," the sergeant hesitated, "should we alert the state police? The military police?" Maxwell shook his head. "This is my responsibility. My prisoners. I'll bring them back." He knew what would happen if the military police found them first. They would be labeled dangerous, treated as threats, possibly shot if they resisted. Maxwell wanted to give them a different ending, wanted to prove that his philosophy could survive even this betrayal. The sun was setting when Maxwell rode out with 6 men, following the boot prints that told a story of desperation. 5 sets of tracks, heading south in a straight line, showed no attempt at deception or misdirection. These were soldiers, not criminals. They ran with purpose, with discipline that made them more dangerous and more tragic. The second day broke hot and merciless. Johann woke with his tongue swollen, his lips cracked and bleeding. The water was half gone. They had covered maybe 40 miles, barely a tenth of the distance to Mexico. Werner was in bad shape, his farm boy complexion burned red, his breathing shallow and rapid. Hans supported him as they walked, but both men were weakening fast. "We need to find water," Karl said, his pilot's practicality cutting through the desperation. "Or we're dead by tomorrow." They searched for hours, following dry stream beds that promised water but delivered only dust. The landscape was alien, Joshua trees and prickly pear, rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of rocks, vultures circling overhead like patient death. By noon, Klaus Bauer was raving, his Nazi ideology bubbling up in fragmented speeches about destiny and duty and the superiority of the German spirit. Johann ignored him, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping Werner upright, on surviving the next hour. That's when he saw the windmill. It rose from the desert like a miracle, its blades turning lazily in the hot breeze, pumping water from deep beneath the earth. A wooden trough sat at its base, filled with clear water for cattle. They ran. What was left of their discipline shattered in the face of that water. They plunged their faces into the trough, drank until their stomachs cramped, splashed water over their burned skin. Johann lay in the mud beside the trough, water soaking into his clothes, and felt tears mixing with the liquid on his face. Not tears of joy, but of shame. This was what they had become. Animals crawling in the mud, reduced to base survival while pretending they served some higher purpose. We rest here, Klaus decided. Wait for night, then continue. But they weren't alone. Maxwell had been tracking them through the heat, his horse covering ground faster than men on foot. He had seen the windmill from a mile away, had known his prisoners would head for it. He approached slowly, his rifle across his saddle but not pointed, his men spread out behind him. The Germans didn't notice until Maxwell was 30 yards away. Klaus Bauer reached for a rock, ready to fight, to die like a soldier rather than surrender like a coward. "Don't," Maxwell said, his voice carrying across the stillness. "Please, don't make me shoot you." Johann stood, water dripping from his clothes, and met Maxwell's eyes. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The desert held its breath. "You came alone," Johann said in broken English, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Not alone," Maxwell gestured to his men. "But not with an army. You're soldiers, not criminals. I wanted to give you the dignity of surrendering to someone who understands." Klaus spat in the mud. "We won't surrender to you, we won't." "Your friends are dying," Maxwell interrupted, nodding at Werner, who lay trembling in the shade. "One of them won't survive another day without medical attention. You can die here as heroes or live as men. Your choice." Johann looked at Werner, at the blood on his cracked lips, at the way his chest heaved with each breath. He thought of his mother in Stuttgart, of whether she would want him to die in a Texas desert for nothing, for pride, for an escape attempt that never had a chance of succeeding. He thought of the bacon at breakfast, of Tom Hutchins and his lemonade, of all the small kindnesses that had confused him, that had slowly eroded the propaganda, that had made him see his enemies as human. "Why did you come yourself?" Johann asked Maxwell. "Why not send the military police?" Maxwell dismounted, approached slowly with his hands visible. "Because I believe that how we treat our enemies defines who we are. You ran because you're in pain, because you're desperate, because the war has taken everything from you. That doesn't make you evil. It makes you human." He held out a canteen. "Drink, then we'll get your friend to a doctor." Johann took the canteen. His hands shook. He drank, the water cool and clean, and felt something inside him finally break. Not his spirit, but his resistance, the last remnants of the ideology that had brought him here. "We surrender," he said quietly. Klaus Bauer cursed, called him a traitor, tried to run into the desert. Maxwell's men caught him within 50 feet, wrestled him down without violence, without cruelty. They rode back to Camp Bowie slowly, Werner supported on a horse between two guards. The sun set behind them, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Johann rode in silence, watching the landscape he had tried to escape through, and understood finally what Maxwell had been trying to teach them. The true battle wasn't between nations or ideologies. It was between the human impulse toward cruelty and the harder choice of compassion. In this desert, in this moment, compassion had won. They arrived at Camp Bowie after midnight. Werner was taken immediately to the infirmary, where the camp doctor worked through the night to save him from severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. The others were placed in the camp's detention barracks, not as punishment, but for their own protection, while Maxwell decided what to do next. Regulations dictated harsh penalties for escape attempts, solitary confinement, reduced rations, possible transfer to a maximum security facility. Maxwell could have followed those rules. His superiors would have expected it. The other prisoners needed to see that escape had consequences. But Maxwell saw something different in Johann's eyes. Not defiance, but understanding. Not Nazi ideology, but a man who had learned something crucial during his desperate flight through the desert. The next morning, Maxwell visited the detention barracks. Johann sat on a wooden bench, his face still burned and peeling. his hands wrapped in bandages from rope burns and cactus spines. "Why didn't you fight?" Maxwell asked, settling onto the bench beside him. "You had rocks, had surprise. Some of my men were close enough to rush." Johann was quiet for a long time, staring at his bandaged hands. "My mother is dead. Or alive. Either way, dying in that desert wouldn't change it. Wouldn't help Germany. Wouldn't accomplish anything except proving I was too stupid to accept kindness when it was offered." Maxwell nodded slowly. "The other guards think I'm a fool. Think I'm too soft, that I should have let you die out there as an example." "Maybe you are a fool," Johann said, but there was no heat in it. "Maybe kindness is foolish in wartime." "Or maybe," Maxwell replied, "kindness is the only thing that can end wars. Not the fighting, the hatred underneath. You can defeat an army, but hatred lives on unless you give men a reason to let it go." He stood, turned to leave, then paused. "You'll serve 30 days in detention. Light work, regular meals. After that, you'll return to the main camp. Your choice whether to run again." "I won't run," Johann said quietly. "There's nowhere to run to that matters anymore." The 30 days passed slowly. Johann worked in the detention barracks, cleaning, maintaining equipment, thinking about everything that had happened. Klaus Bauer was transferred to a different camp, still raging about betrayal, still clinging to ideology like a drowning man to driftwood. But the others stayed. Werner recovered from his ordeal, grateful to be alive, his faith in Nazi propaganda shattered by the simple reality that American doctors had saved his life. Hans and Karl spoke quietly about what they had learned in the desert, that their enemies were more human than their leaders had been. When Johann returned to the main camp, something had changed. The other prisoners knew he had escaped and returned. They watched him carefully, waiting to see what that meant. Tom Hutchins was the first to speak to him when work details resumed. The farmer approached during a water break, his weathered face unreadable. "Heard you took a walk in the desert," Hutchins said, offering Johann a cup of lemonade. "Yes, sir," Johann replied, uncertain how to explain. "See anything worth seeing out there?" Johann thought about the endless wasteland, the vultures, the windmill that had saved them. "No, sir, nothing but death and foolishness." Hutchins nodded. "Desert'll teach you that lesson if you let it. Survival out here requires cooperation, not fighting. Same's true of life, really." He handed Johann the lemonade and walked away, leaving the words to settle like dust. Over the following months, Johann watched the war from his cage in the desert. The newspapers reported Allied advances, German retreats, cities falling. Each defeat felt like a vindication of what he had learned, that the ideology that had led him here was built on lies, that humanity mattered more than national pride. He wrote letters to the Red Cross, trying to locate his mother. In December, a response came. She was alive, living with relatives in the countryside, had survived the bombing of Stuttgart by pure chance. Johann wept when he read the letter, grateful beyond words that she had been spared. That Christmas, Maxwell organized a celebration in the camp. The prisoners received Red Cross packages, sang carols in German, decorated their barracks with whatever materials they could scavenge. The guards brought in a small tree, strung with lights powered by a generator. Johann stood in the assembly hall that evening, watching Americans and Germans share space peacefully, and thought about the windmill in the desert, how close he had come to dying for nothing, how Maxwell's strange philosophy of kindness had saved not just his life, but something more important, his humanity. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Camp Bowie began the slow process of repatriation, sending German prisoners back to a homeland destroyed by bombing and defeat. Johann was among the last to leave, delayed by paperwork and logistics. Before he departed, Maxwell called him to his office. The colonel had aged visibly during the war years, his hair gone gray, lines deepening around his eyes, but his gaze remained steady, compassionate. "I wanted to give you something," Maxwell said, offering an envelope. "Letters from Tom Hutchins from some of the other farmers you worked for. Character references. They might help you when you get home." Johann took the envelope, stunned. Why would they do this? I'm the enemy. You were the enemy, Maxwell corrected. Now you're just a man trying to rebuild his life. They wanted to help. Johann looked at the envelope, at Maxwell, at the office where he had been brought 2 years earlier as a desperate, broken prisoner. What you did here, he said slowly. The way you treated us. It shouldn't have worked. We were taught to see kindness as weakness, to exploit it. And yet, Maxwell prompted. And yet I'm standing here, grateful to be alive, with no hatred left in me for you or your country. Your kindness defeated me more thoroughly than any battle could have. Maxwell smiled sadly. That was always the point. Wars end, but hatred lingers unless we choose to end it. Every prisoner I treated with dignity was one less man who would teach his children to hate America. One less seed planted for future wars. They shook hands. Johann left the office, the envelope of letters in his pocket, and walked toward the transport trucks that would take him to a ship, then home to Germany. The desert stretched around Camp Bowie, unchanged by human conflict, eternal and indifferent. But inside the wire something had changed, not in the landscape, but in the men who had lived there. Prisoners who had arrived believing in Nazi ideology, and left understanding that humanity transcended national boundaries. Years later, historians would study Camp Bowie as a case study in psychological warfare, how kindness could defeat ideology more effectively than cruelty. They would interview prisoners who had been held there, who had returned to Germany with stories of their American captors that confused and challenged the propaganda. Many of those prisoners became advocates for peace, for reconciliation, for the kind of international cooperation that might prevent future wars. They taught their children different lessons than they had been taught, not about racial superiority or national destiny, but about the common humanity that even enemies could share. Johann returned to Stuttgart, found his mother alive in the ruins, helped rebuild a city destroyed by war. He kept Maxwell's letter and the character references from Texas farmers, showed them to his children when they were old enough to understand. Why did the Americans treat you well? His daughter asked when she was 12, reading through the yellowed letters. You were their enemy. Johann thought about the desert, about the windmill, about Maxwell tracking him not with hatred but with concern for his survival. Because, he said slowly, some people understand that the only way to end war is to refuse to let it make you cruel. Your enemy remains human even when everything tells you otherwise. That's the hardest truth to accept, but it's the only one that matters. Colonel James Maxwell retired in 1946, his philosophy vindicated by the thousands of German prisoners who had passed through Camp Bowie without serious incident. He received no medals for his approach, no public recognition. The army preferred stories of military victory, not psychological transformation. But in Stuttgart, in Munich, in Berlin, former prisoners told stories about the colonel in Texas who had treated them with dignity. Those stories spread, creating ripples that extended far beyond the war, influencing how Germany rebuilt itself, how it approached the future, how it taught the next generation to think about former enemies. The camp itself closed in 1946, dismantled and returned to the desert. Within a decade, nothing remained but concrete foundations and rusted wire, slowly being reclaimed by sand and scrub brush. But the lessons persisted. In letters between former prisoners and their American guards, in friendships that crossed the Atlantic, in the understanding that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances if someone was brave enough to insist on it. The windmill still stands in the Texas desert, its blades turning in the wind, pumping water for cattle that graze where desperate men once crawled in the mud. It serves no special purpose, has no historical marker, means nothing to the rancher who maintains it. But if you stand there at sunset, when the heat shimmers like glass and the horizon turns gold, you might understand something about the nature of mercy, how it persists where hatred burns out, how it transforms where cruelty only hardens, how it defeated Johann Kramer more completely than any battle, and in defeating him saved him. That's the story the desert remembers, not of escape and capture, but of the harder journey from ideology to understanding, from enemy to human, from the comfort of hatred to the difficult grace of compassion. And in a ruined world, that transformation mattered more than any military victory.